evening, everyone. My name is Radner, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Andover Historical Society. Thank you for coming. We are grateful to New Hampshire Humanities for helping us make this Humanities to Go program possible. The Humanities is an independent, nonprofit organization whose work is statewide, but they are not a state agency. The Humanities grants support local organizations like ours and help us to host programs such as this one. As a result of their support, our feedback is very important to help them ensure the quality of the programs and to help them secure funding. So please, when the program is over, take a few minutes and fill out your evaluation sheets. That would be very helpful. And you can put them in the basket up here. Tonight's presenter was a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. for 31 years, where she taught literature, folklore, American and Celtic studies, and storytelling. She now lives in Maine and is a freelance storyteller and oral historian. Actually, a couple of our members, myself included, went to a workshop that she gave in Hopkinton on storytelling. Well, actually, it was on oral history. Oral history was very good. Let me see. She is currently writing a book titled Performing the Paper, Rural Self-Improvement in Northern New England, about a 19th century village tradition of creating and performing handwritten literary newspapers. She is past president of the American Folklore Society and the National Storytelling Network. Please welcome Jo Radner. I forgot.
This is the secret message, and it says, cell phones exclamation point. Can anybody guess what it means? I was actually at a performance, a storytelling performance. I was emceeing one many years ago, and our performer was a noted diva who came up on stage and began telling her stories, and her cell phone went off. So I turned mine off even before I came up here, but I want to thank you. I'm very honored that you've asked me to be here. And I'm actually thrilled because I even have some things that are pertinent to East Andover and Webster and other places. And those of you who are refugees from the non-lecture on bats, I hope I will intrigue you. Anyway, this project, this discovery that I'm going to talk about tonight, and if you can't hear me or if I'm behind a pillar, which I am, I don't mind if you move chairs around. If you want to be behind a pillar, that's okay. This discovery began by accident. I stumbled on a real treasure quite a few years ago when it fell to me to empty the attic, well, the whole house, where my great-grandmother had lived in Freiburg, Maine. And, you know, how many of you have ever had to empty the attic of an old house? You find stuff, right? Some of it not so wonderful. 200 years of carefully saved empty cardboard boxes just in case they were needed. A whole box that was labeled keys with no locks. But in that process, I found this amazing treasure. It was a hot summer. Actually, it took me 4 years to empty the house because, you know, it takes a long time when you're contemplating 200 years of your family like that. And I was in the attic, and there was a lot of paper. I have a kind of terminally literate family of school teachers and so on. And there was one pile of paper that I recognized was in my great-grandmother's handwriting. And I picked it up, and it was very weird. There were sort of sentimental, serious moral essays. Virtue, Virtue is a subject which deserves every man's attention. It consists in doing good and in speaking truth, and so on and so on. And then in pencil on the back of the final page of Virtue, there were two jokes. A man entered a printing office to beg a paper. "For," said he, "we like to read newspapers, but our neighbors are too stingy to take one." "Do you retail things here?" remarks a boy to a clerk in a country store. "Yes, sir." "Well, retail my dog, then." Yeah, I mean, it's not my fault. There was doggerel poetry about a sad courting disaster. It's a poem called, you won't be able to read these things, I thought you ought to know what they looked like. A poem called Sam's Soliloquy. A piece of it, the third verse is, "They say I went a-courtin' and 'twas all the neighbors' talk, and very much to my surprise the girls told me to walk. And walk I did, you better believe, and stop I never dare, and so kept on a-going till I tumbled down the stairs." And that's kind of the refrain of the thing. There was a mystifying biblical parody. The last epistle of John to the people of Tollbridge. Tollbridge was the village in the north of Freiburg where my family lived. "I pray you, hearken unto my words, and listen to my parting counsel. He that keepeth a pig, let him hear. And he that ever intendeth to keep a pig, let him hear. And whosoever will, let him hear." And it goes on. And then there was a kind of a recipe, come home economics lesson, headed, "Make your own soap. Obtain a live pig of JWR. Dress it nice. Cut it into many pieces. Try it out. You can get 12 pounds of fat worth 10 cents a pound, making $1.20. Price of pig, $3. Labor, $2.25. Those of you who are accountants have figured that one out. There was some doggerel alphabetical poetry. A is for the well-known Albion P, who thinks it's rather nice a county officer to be. B is for Barker, Frank, you know, with Miss May Ross, we think he will go. C is for Calvin, one who shaves staves, and his mind is all in a flurry about 1 octave. D is for Deacon and also for Dare, who went to snow the bridge and found Buzzle there. I could tell these were sly jokes, but I didn't know anything about why they were funny or who they were about. Some of the what was kind of interesting, you know, reflections of 19th century social history. You know, this fellow, Calvin, who shaves staves, you know, makes barrel staves, and part of the home industry that was people were trying to stay alive in. You know, with in the 19th century in these little towns. Or Deacon, who went to snow the bridge. Y'all know what snowing the bridge was?
No.
Okay, someone explain it.
The
Okay.
sleighs had to have snow on the bridge, so a covered bridge, you had to shovel snow into.
Right, the roof on the bridge protected the wood from rot, but in the wintertime, you couldn't go across them on a sleigh unless you shoveled a whole bunch of snow. So there was that kind of interest, but I wouldn't know why they were funny. And finally, I decided that Great-Grandma Adams had a kinky hobby, and I didn't have time for it, and I put it in a box for later. Years later, I went back to the box, and I picked up a page and realized that the pages were stuck together. And actually, they were sewn together. There was a little bit of sewing, a little bit of thread holding it together on that side. And then I looked even more closely, and right there in the middle, see, in the middle of that page, there, faintly, it said, Tollbridge Journal, Volume 3, Number 6, I think, March 12th, 1870. And that was odd. that was really odd because, as I said, Tollbridge was a tiny village. It didn't have a newspaper, a journal, huh? It didn't even have a store or a church. All it had was a schoolhouse. But that's what it said. And this odd thing. I wonder if the whole hamlet of Tollbridge had the kinky hobby. And I also wondered whether other places had these things. But then when I turned the first page, my questions were somewhat answered. There was an essay called Report of Last Lyceum. It starts out, the people assembled at the Tollbridge Schoolhouse last Saturday Eve in goodly numbers. I presume their object was to hear the eloquence of our Tollbridge debaters and listen to the able productions of Tollbridge contributors to the journal. Well, it didn't really fit my idea of amusements that went on. And, I thought about dances and that sort of thing. But a lyceum, I had heard about the lyceum movement, that urban thing where you'd have subscription to lectures and you'd come in and you'd sit down and you'd hear someone like Emerson deliver a lecture and then go on. This was obviously not that. This was some kind of a debating society. Involved a debate by neighboring people, some of whom were named in this description, and involved listening to the journal. It took place in the Tollbridge Schoolhouse, which was, as I said, the only public building in the neighborhood. This is it. And this is probably what it looked like inside in 1872. You see the benches and the stoves over here, and the youngest scholars would be here, and it would go progressively up, and so on. There's a blackboard, and so on. And it said that the journal was produced by Tollbridge contributors, ordinary neighbors. It was not known as a literary hotbed. It was a place where there were farmers. So I began to wonder whether this was a phenomenon only for Tollbridge. I got some hints. I talked to Stan Howe in the Bethel Historical Society. He said, oh, my people had some of that in East Bethel. And he sent me Xeroxes of pages that looked miscellaneous in the same way. So then, in 1996, I sent out a query to all the historical societies I could locate in New Hampshire and in Maine. And very quickly, I heard from Matthew Thomas of Fremont, way down in the south of the state, who sent me some pieces of the Poplin Herald, edited every Tuesday by the Fremont Literary Society. And it was very much the same mix of wit and wisdom and, the same love of biblical parodies, the same kind of verbal humor as I had in the Tollbridge Journal. So I had two villages more than 100 miles apart, Tollbridge and Freiburg and Fremont in southern New Hampshire, in an era of slow travel. Very unlikely that there was influence between the two. And information kept coming in. I was off and running. People contacted me from all over northern New England. They didn't know what they had, but they had it. There was a woman who lived near Bangor, Maine, who invited me to come up and see what she had. She had 3 different papers. She was an amateur archivist. The basement of her house, which was maybe twice the size of this room, was a complete professional archive. She went to estate sales and bought boxes of family papers and then just sorted through them. And then I just happened to be visiting my friend Andy Prokosh and Susan Schneer here in Andover. And I was telling them about my new discovery of this project and so on. And she said, we've got that. She said, my great-great-aunt, Detta Goodhue in Webster, wrote papers, and I think that's what we've got. And she gave me a magnificent pile of papers to look at. I have some of them up here if you want to look at them afterwards. You're more than welcome to. She was born, her name was Gavuetta Goodhue. She was born in 1859. She was called Detta. And she wrote all kinds of papers between about 1882 and 1895, and I will say more about them later. Then I got a grant for New England archival research, and I went to the Vermont Historical Society, the New Hampshire Historical Society, and I hit pay dirt, which is relevant to you all. Because in the New Hampshire Historical Society, I found 9 issues of the Kearsarge Fountain from East Andover. They were written between 1848 and 1850. This is what some of them looked like. 4 of them were edited by a man named George Emery. There's the Kearsarge Fountain. And, no, actually 5 issues were. Another issue was edited by his friend, William A. Batchelder. And then 3 of them were edited by William Batchelder's sister, Mary Elizabeth Batchelder, who, as it happens, in 1851 became Mrs. George Emery. Up here in pencil it says very lightly, someone later on was correcting the record, M. Emery. Here's her name. Where is it? Somewhere. There it is. Anyway, I'm going to incorporate some examples from the Kearsarge Fountain tonight. I could spend the whole night talking about the Kearsarge Fountain and the Webster papers. I'm not going to do that because I want to give you a picture of the whole tradition that they were part of. But I'm going to put what happened here, almost here anyway, in a bigger perspective. And I tell you, I would love very much to be talking to local historians here and figure out more of how to interpret the Kearsarge Fountain, so I'd be happy to hear from you. Anyway, I began to read more papers, and I began to put together a picture of what this lyceum tradition was. Lyceum in the 19th century actually just meant any literary occasion. It wasn't necessarily that big lecture series. Unfortunately, the people who wrote the papers loved to write about their lyceums in the papers. So they wrote all kinds of things. They wrote about the proceedings, the participants, the history, the founding. Sometimes they wrote it in prose, sometimes in verse, sometimes in a kind of biblical style parody, which I will spare you. But Detta Goodhue actually wrote a versified description of the Webster Lyceum, which is at the end there on the table. But here's a very plain account of the founding of one lyceum. This is the one, this is written in the paper called The Monitor, from the Lyceum in East Cabot, Vermont, in 1878. Editorial. It has now been 3 months since our lyceum commenced, and we have had a very pleasant time. When the subject of starting a lyceum was first broached, the question was asked, who will take part in the debate, and who will sustain the paper? But the ladies came to the rescue, and I think I speak the sentiments of the club in saying that there never was a paper so well sustained in this vicinity as the Monitor. So in addition to accounts in the papers themselves, I found evidence about the lyceums in letters, in diaries, appropriately forgotten 19th century fiction, and especially the lyceum record books, which were usually kept in a bound volume, and they would have the Constitution, the bylaws. All these people love to write constitutions and bylaws. The membership rolls at the outset, minutes of the meetings. I haven't seen one from East Andover. Please check around. But the village lyceums were very similar. And all the way across northern New England, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and some in the Berkshires of western Massachusetts, and some across the pond in upstate New York. Very, very similar for a very long time. The 1830s to the 1890s. It's an immensely consistent pattern. And they all carried on the tradition pretty much in the same way. This is a picture of those gatherings. They usually met weekly, and they usually met in a neighborhood schoolhouse. It was a generic meeting place dedicated to the mind, after all. It didn't have religious overtones, it didn't have political overtones, it just was there. The lyceums were kept only in the winter, between October and March. Those would be the outermost dates. And their participants were both men and women. They'd be farmers mostly, and farmers' families, but also mechanics, that is, people who made things, and merchants, and some of the local leaders, the lawyer, the school teacher, the minister, the doctor. And most of the founders and those who maintained these things with their own energies were young adults, mostly unmarried. The program centered on debates, and it was men who did the debates. Debating was immensely popular in 19th century northern New England. Books were published, like this one, telling you how to debate properly and how to chair a debate, and here are proper topics for the debates and so on. So men would be selected in advance, a week in advance, to be the affirmative and the negative on the announced topic of the debate. Young men, boys, would practice up for public speaking by doing declamations, and they too were trained to do this. Here's another book of appropriate military and rousing political speeches for boys to memorize and deliver. The juvenile speaker. It was a big thing to be chosen to take part in a debate. It was a kind of rite of passage for a young man to take part in the debate. It was huge. Girls also came, younger women or girls, older common school girls, would give recitations of poetry or beautiful stuff. Men and women might present music or a song. Very occasionally, an older, respected member of the community might give a lecture. But almost always, they had papers, and they were called papers. The editor, who was more often than not a woman, and in that case often called the editress, the editor was chosen in advance, and the editor's job was to go around to the neighbors and have them write original pieces for the paper and submit them. Mm-hmm. And then she would select what she wanted, put it in order, and then make a fair copy. Write more if necessary, and it was always necessary, at least an editorial, but maybe some other pieces. And make a fair copy, that is, in her own handwriting, which not only made performing the paper, because it was read out loud, not only made it legible, and therefore she could do it, but also preserved the anonymity of the writers. And as you will see, anonymity was important. As I found more papers, by the way, I realized that those pieces of the Tolbridge Journal I had found were not typical, because they were in different handwritings, different sizes, sort of strung together, and I think that was something that an editor had put together getting ready to make the fair copy, had arranged things in order. But I never found the fair copy. But here, for instance, is one of the issues of this is the March 15th, 1850 issue of the Kearsarge Fountain, a few pages by Mary Batchelder, edited by Mary Batchelder, and you can see that each page, no matter what's on it, different, there's poetry, there's prose, there's double columns and single columns and so on. Each page, whoops, we'll go back, each page is in the same handwriting. She copied it all out before she read it. And reading the paper aloud was a rite of passage for a young woman. Reading was a challenging skill. It was especially associated with women in the 19th century. Women read aloud, but they generally read aloud in domestic kinds of settings, like this. You know, here's a woman reading a book with her children and her approving, adoring husband looking over her shoulder. That was the typical approved setting in which a woman would be reading aloud. But in the papers, that's not at home. That's in public in mixed company. People thought about it a lot. On January 29, 1866, Mary Frances Hodgson of North Waterford, Maine, wrote in her diary, Mrs. J.B. Rand presented the paper. It was not very well read, but there were some good articles in it. She really judged it. But then 3 weeks later, she writes in her diary, I presented the paper. I didn't break down, but failed to satisfy myself in reading. It was a challenge. The Lyceum gave women prominence in a public space that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Indeed, according to the etiquette books of the time, they were not supposed to have. Not supposed to do that. And they had power. Only the editor knew who had submitted each piece. That was power. Think of all the teasing only the editor could unravel. It was good. But with this power and responsibility, there came tribulations. The editor had to persuade the neighbors to write. And this wasn't always easy. Here's an editorial from the Antrim Literary News. It is now 1886, and we suppose, as you have all commenced the new year with many new resolutions, I hope that none of you will forget to make one for the Literary News. That as for you in the future, you will try and write a piece for our paper. If the neighbors wouldn't write enough, the editor had to create most of the paper himself or herself, because most of the pieces in the Lyceum papers were original. The editors sometimes copied published pieces, some poetry, those jokes like the ones that I read you at the beginning, but that was rare. These were original writings by the neighbors. And editors often wrote about their difficulty gathering submissions. Here's from the Gem of the Valley, a paper from West Plymouth in 1880. 'Twas the night before Lyceum, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. An editress sat all alone in her chair, in hopes that contributors soon would be there. And when William Batchelder was editing the Kearsarge Fountain in East Andover, he wrote in the February 14th, 1849 issue, each article written expressly and originally for the present number. Number of pages in this number, 28. Number of writers for this number, 4. Number of pages received from correspondence, 9. So if you do the math, if it's 28 pages and only 9 of them were received from other contributors, poor William Batchelder had to write 19 of them himself. They were prolific, some of these editors. And the contributors, even when they did write, were often very hesitant. Here was a little note that was attached to a piece that was submitted in Freiburg. Dear Miss Adams, herewith find something for the paper, which I trust may be suitable. If you can't read it, send it back and I will hang it up in the cornfield this summer to scare crows. But a lot of people did overcome their fears and they wrote for the papers. And over the past 15 years, I have kept finding more and more papers. The Antrim Literary News is unusually pretty. Somebody really liked to draw, but they don't usually look like this. Here's a pretty typical page from the cover from the Kearsarge Fountain. This is William Batchelder's thing. You can see it doesn't look like a newspaper, does it? But we have volume 2, number 4, whole number 14, I think, or 12. I can't read it from this angle. And the date, February 14th, 1849. Published semi-occasionally, don't you think that? Published semi-occasionally by the publishers, and at number 115 club block. I rather doubt that East Andover had an industrial building that could have been called the club block. Devoted to improvement, happiness, and reform. There's always a motto. And then William A. Batchelder, editor. They loved to play with journalistic terms and conventions. Here's another cover from the South Levant, Maine Independent. And you can see it's got a title that's like a newspaper, of course, and volume and issue numbers and date. Here's the date. Published occasionally, again, they're not semi-occasionally in Maine, published occasionally by the South Levant Reading Club. The motto, improvement and amusement. Wit and wisdom, there you go, you know. Terms of subscription. A composition in advance. The names, here we go, Inez McLaughlin and Nancy Reed, publishers. Usually it's editresses, but publishers. They loved the whole journalistic riff. They loved it. But what was going on? You know, instead of a monetary subscription to this paper, you paid with your own writing. So participation was the important thing, and there's no evidence there was ever more than one copy of any of these. It was just the one copy, and it was intended only to be read aloud. Very different. If this was a paper, it was a paper on their own terms. I have found, by good luck, a lot of Lyceum papers by now. I'm working with about 100. And this is the distribution of papers that I have found. These are not, I haven't read all of these papers, but some of them are alluded to in record books in historical societies. Some of them are mentioned in regional newspapers in town columns, where the Lyceum met and Miss So-and-so read a very good paper, that sort of thing. So this is just a catch as catch can list of things, and you can see here in New Hampshire, y'all are in a hotbed of paper writing, right? Let's see, that would be, that's East Andover, right?
Yeah.
And there's, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. And there's Webster.
Yeah.
This is Franklin Village, not Franklin itself, but a little hamlet within the bounds of Franklin. And let's see, I guess by now, as I say, I've seen close to 100 issues, as well as papers written for other kinds of gatherings. Writing these handwritten papers was hugely popular through the 19th century. If you read Little Women, you know that Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy had a handwritten paper that they did as a family amusement, and that was one context. But they were written in temperance lodges, the common schools. Teachers wrote them for their scholars. There are 3 here that Detta Goodhue wrote for her scholars in Sweats Mills and Courser Hill and North Road. They were created for women's groups and even from spelling schools. Any occasion that people came together, there might be a paper, because they just loved to read these things aloud and perform them. Detta Goodhue's papers are of great value because they cover a lot of different possible venues for the use and the reading of papers, and not only the schools, but she also wrote for the Webster Grange in 1882, and not the Webster Grange, the Webster Lyceum, and then in 85, she wrote for the Webster Grange. She carried the tradition right over into Grange meetings. And in 95, she created a handwritten paper for the ladies of the Methodist Epworth League. So she was very active. But my focus is on the papers that were written by and for the village lyceums for a number of reasons, including the fact that they're the funny ones. They're the ones that have a lot of teasing, that have a lot of reflection of what goes on in the village, that has the widest range of tone. The others tend to be quite serious in various ways, or sentimental, you know. But these have quite a combination. The Kearsarge Journal belonged to a group called the Mountain Club. It was originally the East Andover Social Lyceum in 1848. And then in 1850, when the very short-lived Highland Lake Institute, and I don't know where it was, but you can guess near what it was, the Highland Lake Institute was founded. This was an academy that was initially very successful, had students from many towns around. By the second year, it had 143 students, which was huge for East Andover. It petered out in 1855, so I'm not sure what that's about. But the Highland Lake Institute had 3 different lyceums meeting at it. There were, yes?
This is the building.
Was this the building?
Yeah.
Hot dog. You see? Thank you. That's fabulous. Okay, so this was, we can picture it perfectly, can't we? Wow, they had PowerPoint and they... So anyway, that was, so the Highland Lake Institute had 3 lyceums. It had one for male students and one for women students. And it also then housed what they called the public lyceum, which was the Mountain Club, which produced the Kearsarge Fountain. So I have lots of evidence of decades of community lyceum activity in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine. And I'm not going to identify all these places, but you pretty much see where they are. This is, well, darn it, I keep doing that. This would be Loudon, maybe. Okay, that's Loudon. And then East Concord, that's East Concord. East Concord had a paper called The Icicle in the 1840s. Hopkinton had the Literary Gazette, and so on. They say these are generally from very tiny villages. Towns didn't have these, and I think that's very significant. So go to your attics, if you still have attics. Go to historical societies around and find more of these. By and large, archivists have not known how to catalog them because the tradition is forgotten. So you find them listed as miscellaneous family papers or miscellaneous poetry or whatever. But they're there. They're there. And for me, the huge excitement was finding the voices of these rural people whose voices are by and large not anywhere else. The difficulty was understanding what they were saying and why they were saying it. So, as I say, they're all similar, these papers. They have the same odd jumble. There's always some serious stuff. They're moral essays and poetry, men's vanity, the duties of youth, the influence of bad habits. Things that say, I'm writing this because I understand the community ethos. I understand who we are, basically. And there was some serious concern with contemporary issues. People wrote about temperance, they wrote about the value of farming, and there was a lot of debate about that, of course, in the 19th century on these thin soil hill farms. There were some regional and national concerns. There was a lot of stuff about abolition before the Civil War. Because of the period that the Kearsarge Fountain was being written, there's quite a bit in it about the gold rush and how unwise it is to go in the gold rush. A few pithy anecdotes about that. And then there are celebratory poems about the area. All kinds of poems that showed people loved where they lived. Here's a piece of one about East Andover. called My Native Village. It's a poem. And you can just judge whether it's still true. No lawyer's office e'er was seen within our village fair, nor ever yet hath sheriff been to find the guilty there. In this dear valley all are friends, with no discords to jar, and chests and doors have never need of lock or bolt or bar. Still that way, right? But all of this was in a matrix of humor. It was all kinds of things: satires, jokes, punning rhymes, teasing conundrums, parodies of journalistic genres and political oratory, comic poems, mock biblical prophecies, and even, and these were particularly devastating, I imagine, forged selections from people's personal diaries. And I would say, actually, that most of the papers had more humor than sobriety. It varied from town to town and editor to editor. And this was not true of the other papers that people written, the other handwritten papers. This is just the village lyceums. But here's my puzzle. When I started to look at this, it seemed to me there was a big disconnect between the contents of the papers and what the editors said they were doing. Their purposes. The papers are such a jumble of jokes and stories and serious material. You've got sly teasing on the one hand and philosophy on the other, wit and wisdom. But the editors claimed that this was hugely important. George Emery, who was the editor of the December 19th, 1849 issue of the Kearsarge Fountain, wrote a little bit about his view of the paper. Since it's your paper, I'm going to give you a big chunk of it because it's really nice. You can see these papers have been through the mill. They were kept in somebody's attic or wood box or I don't know what. Anyway, this is the editorial that Emery wrote. And first he wrote about the way that the Mountain Club members received the Kearsarge Fountain. He said, "Many complain that our papers contain too much nonsense, some that they're too sober, not spicy enough, and almost every person will find some fault." So it was a real challenge to please the diverse audience that you had there, and that's worth bearing in mind. That says a lot about why they were so miscellaneous. But this is the way Emery urged members of the club to write pieces for the paper. Let's see, where does he start? Down here. "The Kearsarge Fountain should be supported even at the expense of all our other exercises, aside from our discussions." He means debates, discussions. They use those words interchangeably. "The advantages accruing from discussions and literary compositions as exhibited in the fountain are nearly equal." That's important. "No one will expose his ignorance enough to deny it." And then he takes off on a remarkable rhetorical flight. Maybe I need water before I go on this. It's amazing. By composing, we learn to think deeply. We acquire a command of language and learn to express our thoughts. We enlarge the mind and cultivate the imagination. I like the Band-Aids on this one. New channels of thought are open to the mind. Ideas that glow with beauty, thoughts that burn with the fire of feeling flash like new created constellations of stars across the once dark and unenlightened sky of the mind. And we may go on to higher and higher attainments until the light of knowledge shall beam upon us like the glory of the meridian sun. Let us not scorn the privilege that the pages of the fountain afford us for improvement. Let each member of this club feel that this paper is not calculated only for amusement and enjoyment of the hour, but for a fountain of unfailing good. That was quite a flight. I was impressed. An editor of a Freiburg, Maine paper wrote, "The love of literature, the cultivation of the taste for the beautiful, art and science are not common among us. And then he asked, how shall we begin to win back lost ground? How awaken the languishing interest and stir the smoldering ruins to living flame? Bring out the power lying dormant within us. You know the answer, don't you? Write for the paper. It's a job. And not write a serious essay for the paper. Not write a polished poem for the paper. Write any of the kinds of pieces the paper contains. Write a joke, write a parody news item, write anything. And that will do good for the world. This is really interesting. So I began to think about the humor in light of the statements that people made, like those. First of all, what was the humor about? It was not about politics or religion. Those topics were banned. Many lyceums explicitly refused them, said that that's not what's going to be in the paper. Local distrust of politicians was okay, however. Here's a piece. Mr. Fred Farrington, while in Saco recently, was mistaken for a member of the last legislature and arrested. Things don't change, do they? He was charged with burglary, conspiracy, embezzlement, sedition, and false pretenses. That's sad. It was not that long ago. Apart from generic jokes like "retail my dog," which were sometimes borrowed from the commercial press, most of the humor in the papers dealt with local people and local events. There was no blunder that any farmer could make. There was no prank that could escape notice. Bungling. People loved it when their neighbors bungled stuff. Flights of imagination followed. I finally figured out what all that Tollbridge Journal stuff about hogs was. Turned out that some very respected local farmers had invested in some pigs that turned out to be diseased and subsequently died. This was fodder for the imagination. The writers of Tollbridge responded with 5 different genres of writing about this debacle. There was a brief news item that was headlined, "No Certainty in Hogs." And then there was a notice of a forthcoming scientific lecture upon the subject of hogology, which concludes, John F. Hobbs is respectfully requested not to be present as he might consider the subject personal. We are dealing with a deadpan society. And then mentioned before that long mock biblical epistle of John to the people of Tollbridge, narrating the melancholy history whereby was fulfilled the prophecy, the desolation of the pig pen spoken by the prophet John, maybe that John Hobbs who wasn't supposed to come to the lecture. And then there's that little mock recipe for soap making, which demonstrates the bad economy of buying a pig just to render the lard out of it. And then there was a closing narrative poem, no doubt by the editress, that brought together all the funny events that had happened all week in the Lyceum, which kind of reminds me of, I think it was Stephen King who said that why people read local newspapers is not to find out what happened, but to find out who got caught at it. Kind of thing. The most common topic, though, in these papers, you have to remember that the sustainers of the Lyceums were young adults, were the relations between the sexes. Several of the papers report married men caught in compromising situations. The most extended account, which I cannot resist presenting to you, was headlined "A Startling Incident," and it reports an unsuccessful attempt of a prominent citizen to elope with a married lady. This was not in East Andover, but that's okay. Mr. Abbott's unusual behavior had been giving his wife pause for some time. She reported that once when he came in the house, he actually hung his hat on a hook, so she knew something was wrong. He had never before been known to do it. Well, finally, the wicked man left as if he were going to a committee meeting, or maybe a Hampshire humanities lecture, but he actually picked up one Mrs. Goodwin and set off with her in his wagon. And here's the piece. When halfway to Bethel Hill Corner, the horse became frightened at something by the roadside, and Mr. Abbott, being unable to restrain him, having only one hand not engaged, they were both thrown violently from the wagon, and the horse, freeing himself from the shafts, ran home. A passerby soon noticed the mishap and set about to release the unfortunate couple, who were struggling to regain their equilibrium but were unsuccessful, as the wagon and its contents were topmost. Upon finding herself free, the lady took to her heels, leaving only one thing that betrayed her identity. This was a dental plate set with 2 teeth in front, which were thrown from her mouth at the time of the disaster. Mr. Abbott was injured about the skull and has slowly been recovering his senses ever since, much to the satisfaction of his wife. It is stated upon good authority that as there was a box of eggs in the wagon, the unhappy pair presented a striking symphony in yellow at the time of rescue. This is the second mishap Mr. A has experienced in trying to manage the horse with his dexter hand. Moral: don't try to do 2 things at once. These people, most of the people who wrote for these papers, had only a common school education. Can you imagine how they loved language? Well, events that juicy are pretty rare. But since the young unmarried adults were the people in the Lyceum most actively, and since they had fewer family responsibilities and so on, so they had more time to write in these long winter evenings, romance bulks very large in the papers. And there's a lot of teasing about young people's hopes and their crushes and their successes and their failures at courting, the misfortunes of marriage and the tribulations of bachelorhood. A lot of this is in newspaper parody. Wanted: a wife, one that can cook, wash, mop, dress deer, and skin foxes. And a page later, wanted: a position as housewife, can cook and dress all kinds of game, should prefer a hunter, as I am very fond of wild meat. And from the West Plymouth Gem of the Valley, marriages. The upright, notorious Frank Morse and the surpassingly beautiful Florence Field were united in the holy bonds of door lock. The poor fella had to walk home in the rain, saying it was the first time she ever turned the key on him, she would never have a chance to do it again. Or from the Monitor, East Cabot, Vermont, lost. A very small pasteboard box containing a pinch of ashes, this being all that remains of a true heart, devoured by the flame of love, kindled by that false-hearted lass, Hattie Gilman. Any person finding the same will please return it to its owner, Will Abbott. And then finally, from Sweden, Maine, the Ladies' Enterprise. Answers to correspondence. Stevie Sawyer wishes to know what he shall do when the girls will not let him go home with them. We would advise him to go home alone. They love to do riffs on the popular press. And the papers broadcast rumors about who was sweet on whom. This is very useful, isn't it? In a town, you sort of test the waters and see, who blushes, and here's the editors reading it all out to an audience of victims and authors, and people I've written in diaries. People wrote, I think so-and-so wrote that piece about it. Wild speculation, as if anything was a secret in a very small village. I don't know. Quoting was important as the means to a settled marriage, and there were rules, and people who broke them were teased. Norris Kennison and Rose Goodwin are giving free lessons in modern courtship at all our public entertainments. Come to our lyceums and learn how to court by the improved method. The prospect of long-term failure at courting was dreadful. Bachelors, who were always presented as men who were too inept to get a wife, not as men who preferred not to marry, they were teased mercilessly. Women were always complaining about boorish men, but the men, particularly in East Andover, fought back. And there's a theme that runs through the Kearsarge Fountain about the activities of the so-called East Andover Blue Stocking Knitting Anti-Having Husbands Society. So, what's going on with all this funny business? You know, and how does it help the Lyceum papers, as that Freiburg editress wrote, win back lost grounds, stir the smoldering ruins to living flame, you know, basically save the world? I've got some thoughts about that. I think, for one thing, humor depends on social situations. So this kind of humor is a window into the society of our ancestors. Think about what's going on in northern New England, particularly in little villages in the 19th century. It's a period of huge economic change. There's so much challenge. The railroads from the west are bringing in produce that's been grown in fields that do not grow rocks. The train is making all kinds of transportation possible. There's a lot of challenge to traditional ideals and patterns of family farming and family industry. Young people are leaving for the manufacturing cities, or they're going west, or there's the gold rush out there too. And the United States population is doubling, but in the littlest hill towns, it's shrinking. People are just going. So these papers are actually the rarely heard voices of people who, most of whom, thought they should stay. They wanted to stay. You know, their traditional way of life was superior to what was coming. And so they're profoundly conservative. Take the humor about courting. It's about marry soon and marry local. Preserve our village. Hence the teasing about, you know, possible local partners. Women attracted to the sophistication of the cities were warned seriously about that. Here's one piece from the VZ Light from up near Bangor, Maine, signed with an alias that we could not use today in the same spirit. It's signed Gay Spanker. Anyway, he's advising VZ girls to stop simpering or playing the fool to some brainless, mustached fox in the parlor. Better set your cap for that young farmer or river driver whom you have nearly died a-laughing so many times. Go to work and be no longer the contempt of all the smart, active, go-ahead, marriageable young men in VZ. So preserve the traditional qualities of the village. You know, keep it egalitarian. Play down all those kinds of social inequalities. I think that was important. So in the rural lyceums, you know, neighbors of very different ages and different classes all came together with this same idea, you know, bent on, as they put it, intellectual entertainment and improvement. Schools are not the place of final education. You are responsible for your own education, your own mental training. You find that in the journals for school journals for the period, but it's also in some of the papers. Here's a piece from Llandaff, New Hampshire, called How to Educate Oneself. The idea that schools are indispensable in acquiring knowledge is without foundation. All persons, however situated, may gain wisdom and knowledge every day, may add new treasures to the intellect as often as earth revolves. If any would educate themselves, they must be dependent on no teacher, minister, doctor, or lawyer, but must be all of these to themselves. So writing for the paper is part of what you need to do in order to train your mind, just like being in the debate. Thought engenders thought. Place one idea upon paper, another will follow it, and still another, until you have written a page. At first your ideas may come in lumps, homely and shapeless, but no matter. Time and perseverance will arrange and refine them. But it wasn't just writing for the paper that mattered. It was taking part in the Lyceum. Now, this conviction, this seems to me hugely important, that we learn better face-to-face, better even than from reading. That face-to-face, adjusting your ideas to someone else's and balancing them off, and writing and trying to communicate, is the way to train yourself. And I just love this as a message for our screen-to-screen world. I think it's very important. People love their lyceums as neighborhood communities. And I want to close with the final piece in, this is from 1881, in the South Levant, Maine Independent. This is about the Lyceum. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to start down here. And here on winter evenings bright, we've met on each successive Wednesday night for good and fun combined. I fear 'twas oftener fun we came to find. However, that is only boyish nature. Read and speak and hear the paper. And as we've listened to some sharp bit of pointed scorn or youthful wit, we've laughed to see the faces change and shrink behind our vision's range. But when they joked us in our turn, with silent rage our face would burn. Going down further in this, the final stanza. When time has left its blighting trace on this dear and hallowed place, then whene'er the Grand Master may call us away from the trials and troubles of life's fleeting day, from the reading club on earth which our hearts dearly love, may we all meet at last in the grand club above. That is, the Lyceum is a foretaste of heaven. Right? And we know what heaven looked like. This is a little more elaborate heaven, but you know, it's heaven, right? And I realize why I love the papers so much, especially within the Lyceums, because the papers were intensifying this sense of community. They were the only Lyceum activity in which everybody was asked to take part, old, young, male, female, whatever. So that when the editor stood up to read, what the editor was actually doing was performing the community voice. All the diverse villagers' written conversation in one way or another. So that this was a true community voice, and it gave back to the Lyceum as a whole an oral image of itself, kind of multiple but united. It was an intergenerational and cooperative world in which the young and the old remind themselves and express their opinions about important values of the local area and of life in the world. And people are praised for their achievements and teased for their faults. And the editors were creating and echoing back to their community its ideal democratic self. You know, kind of model for the nation writ small. So that's what I have to say, and I encourage you, I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time. We have time for questions. If you have questions or comments or ideas, I'd love to hear them, and then you're more than welcome to come up and look at Susan Schneer's great-great-aunt's papers to get a sense of what they're like. I also have a couple of my own CDs which have nothing to do with this in case you'd like to look at Yes?
What is your book's title and when is it coming out?
Its working title is Performing the Paper, but I don't know whether that will be the final title, and I don't know when it's coming out, but when you ask that, it gives me a little push. Thank you. I'll let you know. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that politics was outlawed in these, but you, on the other hand, you said they covered the abolition movement. Was that an exception?
Yes, I think it was because it was not a divisive issue. Most of these villages were, staunch abolition places. And the way you get abolition issues, as I've seen, is in little stories rather than essays or disquisitions. So that there'll be a story about a husband and wife separated and the wife dying of a broken heart, that kind of thing. Yeah, politics, I think local politics or presidential politics, that sort of thing, would have been outlawed. Anything that was likely to cause division. Because as you know, if you live in a small village, you have to get along with people. On Tuesday nights I go and play volleyball with people whose politics I deplore, and who deplore my politics, but we have such a good time. It's important that we don't talk about politics, we just bash each other with a ball. So, yes?
Where did you find access to most of these?
Wow, it's all over the place. It was really catch as catch can, and that map that I showed you was really, you could, it's like mice. I don't know about you, but right now, I know mice. And I've deported 5 mice in the last 2 days, and I know that means that there are maybe 100. Yes. And it's the same thing with the papers. I think what has survived is absolutely by chance, and in fact, it's not like mice because there weren't that many. The papers that you have here from, or they now have in Concord from East Andover, for instance, were preserved because they were kept in one household. There was no archive. None of these lyceums had an archive and kept their papers. So that the papers I've found have tended to be either from the same editor or from the same family. And for some reason, they happen to save them, usually in the attic. But most of them have gone. They were meant to be ephemeral. They were created for that moment, face to face. And it's a hard thing to think, but that preservation wasn't the issue. In the Batchelder home, on one of the pieces, there's a hilarious piece in one of the papers called Kissing by the editor. It starts out, well, you might misunderstand this title. It's not that the editor has himself, or will, or might, or could ever indulge in kissing. It's that this is written. Anyway, there's this hilarious piece about kissing, and then it's followed by a piece opposed to kissing. And there's a little handwritten penciled note on it saying, read at the Grange, and there was a date in 1884. And it was written actually in 1849, but the Batchelder household kept it, and William Batchelder actually read it at the Grange in 1884, because he'd gone through it and liked it still. So sometimes that's why I say look in your attics, because people don't know what they are. It's a lost treasure. The tradition's completely forgotten. But some of them are in private homes, some of them are in state and local historical societies. You can find them anywhere. Okay. Yes.
Have you seen evidence that there were similar reading clubs in big cities?
Yes, there were not. There were other things. There were women's clubs, and women tended to get together in the cities and read in books and talk to each other about what they were reading and that sort of thing. There was that sort of self-improvement. There were the lecture lyceums, but for the most part, there wasn't the same write your own, read it to the community. Women would never have done that in the cities. It only happened here, in little towns. And it was much more, farm women had to take a lot of responsibility. And by the mid-century, the bulk of school teachers in one-room schools, which were usually the place for these lyceums, were women, young women. And people were getting used to seeing women in a position of judgment and authority as teachers. So that sometimes, later in the century, after the Civil War, sometimes women joined in the debates. But even before the Civil War, they were often asked to be judges in the debates because they had that critical teaching mind. So it was in the small towns, I think, that women had more freedom in a number of ways than they did in the cities. Yes?
I had a question about, do you have a way of accounting for the decline of this tradition? And did it happen quickly? Do you find there's a cutoff point, or did it sort of peter out? And was it connected with the lyceums, folding?
No. I mean the Lyceum movement?
The Lyceum movement.
That was pretty much petered out by the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was kind of like a circus, entertainment kinds of things. No, these outlasted the urban Lyceum movement by a long shot. My guess is it's over by the 1890s. There's no trace of it after that at all. My sense is that that whole movement and belief in the importance of self-education and the importance of training your mind in a general way in order to step into any kind of profession, from law to the ministry to farming to being a mother. And all of those things were equally trained for by the Lyceum, and people will write about what a boost they've had in their careers by having done this sort of thing. By the 1890s, we have specialization. We have certification. We don't have that kind of general sense, and a very different economic sense as well. And I think it simply had no more legs. Sorry to say, it'd be nice to bring it back. Well, thank you so very much. And,